Secrets were meant to stay buried, but when a forbidden affair turns into blackmail, Gavin Brooks finds himself trapped between desire and destruction. What began as a reckless passion spirals into a deadly game of deception. At 38, Gavin Brooks was an esteemed literature professor. With over a decade of teaching experience, he had built a reputation as a brilliant academic, making even the densest poetry feel accessible to his students. His well-tailored suits, confident stride, and engaging lectures made him a campus favorite. On the surface, Gavin appeared to have respect, a steady career, and a charming persona, but his life was far from perfect. Beneath the surface, Gavin was unraveling. His marriage to Emily Brooks, a fellow academic, had long lost its spark. Their relationship had become a mechanical routine of formal dinners, polite conversations, and evenings spent in separate corners of their home. For years, Gavin buried himself in his work, convincing himself that passion was fleeting, something only found in books. His love for literature had been the one constant in his life, but even that began to lose its luster as the years passed. As Gavin approached 38, the weight of his dissatisfaction grew more intense. It gnawed at him, a slow-burning unease that worsened each day. While his students saw him as the epitome of success, Gavin felt trapped in his own life, suffocated by routine and empty ambitions. His charm remained intact, but emotionally, he was fraying at the edges, leaving him more vulnerable than he had ever imagined. That's when Liam Foster entered his life. At 21, Liam was a strikingly handsome and ambitious student, but charm and charisma were his real assets. With his broad smile, quick wit, and disarming ease, Liam had always been able to get what he wanted. Born to a middle-class family, he had learned early on that to get ahead, you had to work hard, or in Liam's case, manipulate others into giving you what you wanted. He didn't see this as wrong, but rather as a natural extension of his intelligence and survival instincts. Liam had grown up idolizing those in positions of power, but not for their wisdom. He admired how they bent others to their will. It wasn't intellect that drew him to academics like Gavin. It was the authority they carried, the control they had over people's perceptions. As a student, Liam was bright, quick on his feet, and effortlessly engaging. Professors were impressed by his eagerness to learn and his natural ability to lead class discussions, but his classmates saw the cracks in his charm. They knew that Liam's ambitions sometimes led him down manipulative paths. While most people dismissed these as minor flaws, those who knew him well understood his deeper motives. By his third year at the university, Liam had developed a sense of entitlement beyond just good grades. He felt he deserved more: recognition, power, even wealth, and he wasn't afraid to take it by any means necessary. His grades were stellar, but his ambition demanded more than academic success. It craved leverage over the people around him. When Liam first met Gavin, he saw not a mentor, but an opportunity to exploit. It was a late autumn afternoon when Gavin first met Liam. Gavin had just begun his modern poetry seminar, a small class of highly motivated students. Liam, sitting at the back of the room, immediately stood out to Gavin, though he wasn't sure why. There was something about Liam's intense focus and charismatic energy that caught his attention. As the weeks went by, Liam frequently stayed after class to ask more questions. He was always eager to discuss the material in depth, offering interpretations that impressed Gavin. Liam seemed fascinated by Gavin's life, asking about his career, frustrations, and even his personal life. Gavin, starved for emotional connection and validation, found himself opening up to this eager young student more than he should have. Their talks became increasingly personal until one evening over drinks, Liam made the first move. Gavin knew what Liam wanted, and for a brief moment he considered stopping it before it went any further. What began as innocent flirtation between Gavin Brooks and Liam Foster quickly spiraled into a secretive and dangerous affair. Their connection, born from late-night conversations in the professor's office, grew from subtle glances and shared intellectual interests into something far more intimate. Gavin had been craving excitement and passion for years, a reprieve from the stagnation of his personal life. His marriage to Emily was falling apart, and his work had lost its appeal. Meeting Liam gave him the spark he had longed for, but never dared to seek. Their encounters became more frequent, and with each one, Gavin felt himself slipping further from reality. He justified his actions, convincing himself that he deserved happiness, that what he shared with Liam was special. But what Gavin saw as a romantic, albeit risky relationship was far more complex. He was becoming entangled in a web he hadn't anticipated. They met in secret, his office after hours, quiet corners of the campus where they thought no one would notice. The thrill of hiding their relationship only fueled Gavin's growing obsession. He had never felt so alive, so desired. Liam brought energy into his life, and for a time, it seemed Gavin had found what he had been missing. Yet beneath that excitement, doubt lingered, creeping in whenever he thought about the consequences if their relationship were exposed. Unbeknownst to Gavin, Liam had been playing a different game. From the beginning, Liam's intentions went beyond romance. While Gavin saw the affair as an escape, Liam saw an opportunity. He wasn't just interested in the older man's attention, he was interested in control, leverage, and the power that came with it. For Liam, this wasn't about love, it was about testing boundaries and seeing how much he could gain from the situation. Behind Gavin's back, Liam began documenting their secret encounters. With each meeting, he discreetly recorded moments of intimacy, compiling a collection of evidence he intended to use to his advantage. It wasn't that he wanted to expose the affair immediately, but he needed a safety net, something to protect himself if things went sour. For Liam, control was key, and this was his way of ensuring he always held the upper hand. As the weeks passed, Gavin began to feel the weight of their affair pressing down on him. The guilt was becoming harder to ignore, especially as he spent more time sneaking around, lying to his wife, and covering his tracks at the university. Every time he met Liam, the exhilaration was tinged with fear. Fear of being caught, of losing everything he had worked for. The secret that had once been thrilling now felt like a looming threat, something that could unravel his life at any moment. While Gavin struggled with the emotional toll, Liam remained calm and collected. He could sense Gavin's growing anxiety, knowing it only gave him more control. Every time Gavin seemed close to pulling away or reconsidering their relationship, Liam would draw him back in, feeding his need for validation and affection. It was careful manipulation, one that Gavin couldn't see through in his emotional haze. Gavin's dependence on Liam grew stronger with each passing day, but so did his unease. He began to notice subtle changes in Liam's behavior, moments where the younger man seemed more calculating, more distant. At first, Gavin brushed it off, thinking it was just the natural progression of their secretive relationship. But the nagging feeling that something was off became impossible to ignore. Gavin's world was unraveling faster than he could have imagined. The secrecy, the lies, and the weight of his double life had begun to take their toll. He found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, half expecting someone to discover the truth. But he never anticipated that the real threat wasn't from the outside. It was right there with him, sitting calmly, smiling, and watching everything unfold from a position of control. The day everything shifted, Gavin received a message from Liam asking for a meeting at an obscure location off campus. Gavin was already on edge, sensing a coldness in Liam's tone, something different from their usual playful exchanges. When they met, it wasn't the warm rendezvous Gavin had grown accustomed to. There was an unnerving change in Liam's demeanor, a smugness that left Gavin unsettled. The air between them was tense, and soon the conversation took a turn Gavin never expected. Liam revealed what Gavin had feared most, but could have never predicted. He had been recording their encounters. Every secret meeting, every moment of intimacy had been documented and stored away. With cold calculation, Liam laid out his intentions. The videos were his insurance. If Gavin didn't comply with his demands, those recordings would be made public. Gavin's heart sank as he realized Liam had planned this all along. He wasn't just a naive student swept up in a romantic affair. He had been in control the entire time, and now Gavin was at his mercy. Liam's demands were clear: better grades, money, and most importantly, Gavin's continued compliance. The younger man knew the kind of damage those videos could cause. Gavin would lose his career, his marriage, and his reputation. Everything he had worked for could be shattered in an instant, and the worst part, Gavin couldn't fight back. He was trapped, caught in a web of his own making, now at the mercy of someone who had been carefully pulling the strings all along. For Gavin, the world began to close in. His mind raced, desperately trying to figure out a way out of the situation. But the more he thought about it, the more helpless he felt. Liam had calculated every move, leaving Gavin with no room for escape. If he refused, the consequences would be too dire to imagine. The thought of his wife Emily discovering the affair was terrifying enough, but the public humiliation, the inevitable professional downfall, and the collapse of everything he had built would be unbearable. Days after the blackmail began, Gavin's entire demeanor shifted. He was constantly distracted, unable to focus in lectures or maintain a coherent conversation with his colleagues. Even his students noticed the change, though none dared to mention it. At home, Emily sensed the tension but chalked it up to the usual stress of work. Only Gavin understood the crushing weight of what he was carrying. Meanwhile, Liam continued to play his game, appearing calm and collected. He still smiled at Gavin when they crossed paths on campus, still sent messages as if nothing was amiss. But beneath that calm exterior lay the constant threat of exposure. Each time Gavin saw him, his heart raced with a mix of fear and fury. How had he been so blind, falling into such a manipulative trap? How could he have let Liam take control of his life so completely? With no one to turn to and the looming threat of exposure ever present, Gavin spiraled deeper into despair. The affair that once provided him with a sense of freedom had become a prison, with Liam holding the keys. Each interaction with Liam served as a reminder of just how powerless he was. As Gavin's life spiraled further out of control, he knew he couldn't continue living under such immense pressure. But what could he do? There was no way out that didn't lead to his ruin. The blackmail had him tightly in its grip, and Gavin was left wondering how much longer he could survive the burden of his secret. In a moment of desperation, Gavin confided in his old college friend, Ethan Rivers. Ethan had been Gavin's best friend since their college days. A charming, loyal, yet reckless man, Ethan, now 39, worked in construction and had lived a far more volatile life than his friend. While Gavin followed a more predictable academic path, Ethan bounced from one job to another, often quitting or getting fired due to his impulsive nature. Despite their different lives, their friendship remained strong. Ethan was the type of friend who never asked too many questions. He operated by a code of loyalty. If someone he cared about was in trouble, he'd do whatever it took to help, no matter how dangerous or irrational the situation. His loyalty, however, came with its own complications. Ethan's solutions were always extreme, often rooted in aggression rather than logic. His life had been marked by small acts of violence, but nothing serious enough to land him in real trouble. In the dimly lit corner of a quiet bar, Gavin poured his heart out, explaining how Liam had gone from a trusted confidant to a blackmailer who held his life in his hands. Each word lifted some of the burden from Gavin's chest, but the intensity in Ethan's eyes made it clear that the situation was far from over. Ethan leaned in, his voice low and simmering with anger. He couldn't believe that Liam held such power over Gavin. The idea of Gavin being blackmailed enraged him. "We need to put an end to this," Ethan insisted, his voice charged with determination. Gavin, weighed down by weeks of sleepless nights and constant fear, felt the urgency of Ethan's words. He knew something had to change. The idea of facing Liam terrified him, but Ethan's confidence planted a seed of hope. Maybe they could put an end to this nightmare. Ethan's plan was dangerous but simple. Confront Liam head-on and strip him of his power. Gavin felt a pang of dread at the thought of facing Liam, but the idea of reclaiming his life was too tempting to resist. With Ethan's support, Gavin could finally take back control. That night, as Gavin left the bar, he felt a renewed sense of determination. The fear and desperation had morphed into a fierce resolve. With Ethan at his side, he was ready to confront Liam and free himself from the blackmail. The battle for his freedom had just begun. The night was thick with tension as Gavin and Ethan waited outside a campus cafe, watching for Liam's arrival. Their plan was simple: lure Liam into a conversation under the pretense of discussing his grades. Gavin's heart pounded in his chest as he spotted Liam approaching, that same confident smirk on his face. The time had come. The stakes had never been higher. As Alex approached, Gavin forced a strained smile, concealing the anxiety roiling inside him. He suggested they take a walk, mentioning Alex's progress, while subtly guiding them toward the quieter paths of the campus. Under the dim, flickering streetlights, Gavin felt the looming weight of the impending confrontation. Each step brought him closer to a resolution he both dreaded and craved. Alex's manipulation had to end, and Gavin reminded himself of the stakes. Ethan followed closely, ready to step in when the time came. Leading Alex deeper into the shadows, the quiet surroundings magnified the tension. Gavin's heart pounded relentlessly, each thud reminding him of the critical moment approaching. They stopped in a secluded area where the faint glow from the streetlights barely reached, creating a sense of eerie isolation. It felt daunting, yet necessary. Facing Alex, Gavin's expression turned serious. The urgency of the situation pressed down on him, and he fought to maintain control over his fear. His declaration was firm. This relationship had to end, and he could no longer allow Alex to manipulate his life. Alex reacted with a dismissive laugh, entirely unfazed by Gavin's serious tone. He remained arrogant, shrugging off Gavin's attempts to reclaim control. It was clear Alex believed he still held the upper hand, asserting that Gavin had no say in their dynamic. The disregard only fueled Gavin's frustration, the weight of their shared history making it harder for him to push through the emotional turmoil. Seeing that any further discussion was pointless, Gavin turned and walked away, feeling a complicated mix of relief and regret. As he left, the magnitude of his decision settled in, though he couldn't shake the uncertainty lingering in his chest. Alex, on the other hand, felt triumphant. He believed he had once again imposed his dominance over Gavin, strolling through the dim streets without a care. Unbeknownst to him, danger lurked just behind. Ethan followed from a distance, adrenaline coursing through him as he resolved to protect Gavin at all costs. Ethan kept his eyes locked on Alex, carefully moving in the shadows to remain unnoticed. He could see the swagger in Alex's step begin to fade as they approached a more isolated part of the campus. The streetlights flickered intermittently, casting fleeting moments of darkness that heightened the unease. As they entered a deserted alleyway, Ethan's determination grew. He couldn't let Alex continue to manipulate Gavin's life, and tonight would be the night it ended. Quickening his pace, Ethan closed in, his heart racing. Calling out to Alex, Ethan broke the silence, his voice hard and unwavering. Alex, startled, turned to face him, his expression shifting from surprise to irritation as he recognized the threat. His defensive posture betrayed his attempts to maintain control over the situation. Ethan's thoughts raced as he faced Alex, anger and protectiveness intertwining. He knew he couldn't allow Alex's arrogance to shake him. In that instant, Ethan realized he was willing to do whatever it took to protect Gavin from the toxic grasp Alex had on him. With swift, decisive action, Ethan pulled a gun from beneath his jacket. The alleyway fell into a suffocating silence, the tension so thick it felt palpable. Alex's bravado faltered, his eyes widening in shock as he processed the deadly turn their encounter had taken. Desperation clouded Alex's face as he began pleading, his arrogance crumbling under the pressure. But Ethan's resolve only strengthened. There was no turning back now. The weight of the gun in his hand felt both freeing and terrifying. An instrument of finality that could change everything. Ethan stood firm, knowing the decision he made here would alter the course of all their lives forever. As Alex took a cautious step back, trying to regain control of the situation, Ethan felt a surge of adrenaline pulse through him. He never imagined he'd be in a position like this, gun in hand, facing down a person who had pushed him and Gavin to the brink. But here he was, driven by a sense of duty to protect his friend no matter the cost. With each second that passed, his resolve hardened. Alex had manipulated Gavin for too long, and Ethan was determined to end it. In an instant, everything shifted. Ethan's finger tightened on the trigger, his voice rising with fury as he demanded Alex understand the gravity of what he'd done. Ethan had reached his breaking point, and in that moment, he saw no other way. A deafening gunshot ripped through the night, shattering the silence. The sound echoed in the narrow alley, hanging in the air like a dark omen. Alex's face contorted in shock and disbelief before his body crumpled to the ground, lifeless. Time seemed to crawl as Ethan stood motionless, the weight of his actions sinking in. The adrenaline that had fueled him drained away, leaving behind a hollow feeling of dread. Horror and regret quickly replaced the anger that had consumed him. He had acted in a fit of rage, and now there was no undoing what had just happened. Stumbling backward, Ethan retreated into the shadows, the same darkness from which he had emerged minutes earlier. His mind raced, thoughts tangled in panic. What would happen now? What would Gavin think? The threat to his friend had been eliminated, but in doing so, Ethan had entangled himself in a web of consequences, fear, and uncertainty. He knew that his life, and Gavin's, would never be the same. As the morning light filtered through Gavin's window, it painted the room in a soft, unsettling calm. He sat at his table, sipping his coffee, unaware of the storm about to crash into his life. Reaching for the remote, he flipped on the television, expecting the usual morning news, but something caught his attention. The news anchor's somber tone sent a shiver down his spine as the headline appeared on screen. Local university student found dead in alleyway. Gavin's heart stopped when he heard the name. The name reverberated through his mind, stirring memories of their tumultuous relationship. It wasn't just the name that shook him. It was the realization of what had happened. Alex was dead, and this was no random accident. It was the violent end to a dangerous saga that had spiraled out of control. Panic surged through Gavin as he grabbed his phone, his fingers trembling while dialing Ethan's number. Each unanswered ring filled him with dread. He had seen Ethan's growing frustration, the anger bubbling beneath the surface, but he had never imagined things would end like this. He had thought the plan was simple: confront Alex, end the manipulation, and walk away. Violence was never part of the plan. Gavin's mind swirled with grief, anger, and disbelief. The weight of what Ethan had done pressed heavily on Gavin's chest. Their friendship, once a source of strength, now felt fragile, shattered by a reckless act that could never be undone. He knew he had to find Ethan, to demand answers, to understand what had driven him to such an extreme. But deep down, Gavin understood that no matter the explanation, things could never go back to the way they were. The delicate bond they had shared was broken, replaced by the grim reality of betrayal and loss. As Gavin stood alone in his apartment, the unanswered phone calls ringing in his ears, he couldn't escape the haunting question that loomed over him. How far would he go to protect the people he loved? And perhaps more troubling, what would he lose in the process? Gavin drove to Ethan's house the day after the tragic news about Alex's death broke. The events of the previous night played over and over in his mind, the weight of guilt pressing heavily on his chest. He had hoped this confrontation would ease his internal turmoil, but as he approached Ethan's door, a sense of dread gripped him. What could he say to his friend now? The door creaked open, and Gavin stepped inside, finding Ethan slumped on the living room couch, surrounded by empty bottles. The remnants of a long night spent drowning in sorrow were scattered around the room. Ethan looked up as Gavin entered, his bloodshot eyes hollow, filled with despair and regret. His face, once sharp and full of conviction, now bore the weight of what he had done. Seeing Ethan like this tore at Gavin's heart. This was his best friend, someone who had always been strong, even in the darkest times. But now, Ethan was a shadow of himself, completely lost in the aftermath of his actions. Without saying a word, Gavin sat beside him, the silence between them heavy with unspoken pain. He glanced at Ethan's face, noticing the tight lines of anguish that had etched themselves deeply into his friend's features. Gavin felt a deep wave of pity rise within him, mixed with a quiet understanding of the desperation that had driven Ethan to act as he had. He too had felt helpless under Alex's manipulation, but he never imagined things spiraling out of control like this. Ethan's quiet sobs soon broke the silence, his shoulders shaking as he buried his face in his hands. Gavin sat there, still watching his friend unravel. His own emotions swirled, threatening to overwhelm him, but he held it back. He wanted to tell Ethan that things would be okay, to reach out and console him, but he knew there was no simple reassurance in this situation. The reality of Alex's death, the irreversible damage it had caused, hung between them like a thick fog. For a moment, Gavin's mind drifted to their shared secret, the terrible truth that would forever bind them. The weight of it pressed down on him, his conscience struggling under the burden. He knew revealing what he knew would only destroy Ethan even more. but staying silent gnawed at him in ways he couldn't fully explain. Despite that, he convinced himself that keeping quiet was an act of loyalty. It was better to bear the weight of this secret together than to let it tear them both apart. The hours passed slowly, the silence between them torturous. Gavin eventually stood up, glancing once more at Ethan, who had now curled into himself, his sobs growing softer but no less heart-wrenching. Gavin's heart broke as he left the house, the door closing behind him with a finality that sent a pang of remorse through his chest. As he drove away, the overwhelming sense of guilt only deepened. His thoughts were a mess of conflicting emotions, regret, fear, and loyalty all battling for space in his mind. The decision to stay silent weighed on him, but he kept telling himself it was the right thing to do. Protecting Ethan mattered more than the truth, at least for now. But deep down, Gavin knew that secrets never stayed hidden forever. The consequences of their actions were looming, and sooner or later, they would catch up to them. When Gavin arrived at work, everything felt distant, as if he were moving through a haze. He attended meetings, responded to emails, and made small talk with his colleagues, but his mind was far from the present. The burden of his secret clung to him, making each interaction feel meaningless. Every glance at the clock, every idle moment, brought him back to the terrible reality of what they had done. He wondered how long they could keep this up, and what would happen when the truth inevitably surfaced. Gavin knew that their lives, once normal, were now forever altered, and there was no turning back. The investigation into Alex's tragic death commenced almost immediately. Law enforcement descended upon the scene, methodically examining every detail of the crime. As they scanned the area for potential evidence, a nearby CCTV camera became the focal point of their inquiry. The footage from the camera revealed a chilling sequence of events. Ethan exiting the alley shortly after the time of the murder. The police studied the footage intently. Ethan's presence at the scene made him a key figure in the investigation. As the detectives continued their work, they stumbled upon another significant piece of evidence: Alex's phone. Inside, they found videos that documented the intimate encounters between Gavin and Alex, revealing the depth of their clandestine relationship. The existence of this footage changed everything. What initially seemed like a case of passion turned deadly now appeared layered with deceit, manipulation, and a motive that could tie both men to Alex's death. Detective Kelvin Bricks led the investigation with a steady hand, acutely aware that he was navigating a complex web of relationships and betrayal. He organized a meeting with his team to discuss their findings, emphasizing the urgency of bringing both Gavin and Ethan in for questioning. Within hours, the two men were summoned to the police station. As they walked into the precinct, a sense of foreboding filled the air. Gavin and Ethan exchanged anxious glances, both knowing that the investigation had taken an unexpected turn. They were on the precipice of a storm, and the weight of their secret loomed heavily over them. Once inside, they were separated into different interrogation rooms. Detective Bricks approached Ethan first, his demeanor professional yet stern. The detective wasted no time, laying out the evidence gathered against him, the CCTV footage and the videos on Alex's phone. The evidence painted a damning picture, leaving little room for denial. Meanwhile, in a separate room, Gavin sat nervously, replaying the events of the past few days in his mind. He felt the walls closing in as he awaited his turn to be questioned. The realization of how precariously their situation hung became overwhelming. He knew the police had enough to implicate both of them, and the bond they had forged through secrecy now threatened to shatter under the scrutiny of law enforcement. As the interrogation began, both Ethan and Gavin grappled with the truth of their actions and the reality of their choices. The tangled threads of betrayal, desperation, and guilt wove together, creating a narrative that neither of them could escape. They were about to face the consequences of their decisions, and the shadows of deceit would soon unravel the lives they had built. As the investigation unfolded, the atmosphere in the precinct became increasingly tense. Detective Kelvin Bricks and his team continued to sift through the evidence, determined to uncover the truth behind Alex's death. While the CCTV footage and videos on Alex's phone had already raised serious questions about Gavin and Ethan's involvement, The breakthrough came when the police conducted a thorough search of the campus grounds. On a hunch, they combed through a nearby bush, slightly apart from the main paths and hidden from casual view. To their astonishment, buried beneath some leaves lay the murder weapon, a handgun. The weapon was grimy, but its significance was undeniable. Upon further examination, the police discovered Ethan's fingerprints on the grip, solidifying his connection to the crime scene. Detective Bricks felt a surge of adrenaline. This new evidence shifted the trajectory of the investigation entirely. He knew that the discovery of the murder weapon with Ethan's fingerprints would undoubtedly tip the scales of justice against him. It was a turning point that both men had feared, yet seemed inevitable. As news of the weapon's discovery reached the interrogation rooms, the weight of the situation became unbearable for Ethan. He had always been charismatic and persuasive, but in that moment, he felt the walls closing in, tightening around him like a noose. He realized that the facade they had built together was crumbling, revealing the harsh reality of their choices. Meanwhile, Gavin remained isolated in his own room, anxiety gnawing at him as he awaited his questioning. He had been trying to convince himself that they could navigate this together, but now, with the murder weapon found and the implications of Ethan's fingerprints, he understood the gravity of their situation. Each second ticked by like an eternity, and he felt a mix of dread and guilt for not having stopped Ethan from taking that fateful step. When the officers finally brought Gavin in for questioning, he could sense a shift in energy. Detective Bricks was now armed with a wealth of evidence, and he wasn't about to let either man off easy. Gavin's mind raced as he prepared to face the consequences of their actions. He knew that their bond had put them in this predicament, but would their friendship be enough to withstand the weight of the truth? As the detective laid out the case against Gavin, he emphasized the discovery of the murder weapon, detailing how it implicated Ethan. Gavin's heart sank further, knowing that Ethan's actions had spiraled out of control. The detective's piercing gaze made it clear that he was not just seeking answers, he was looking for accountability. Gavin realized that the lies they had spun together could no longer shield them from the reality of the crime. Gavin felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him. With trembling hands and a heavy heart, he finally admitted to being complicit in Alex's murder. He recounted the events leading up to that fateful night, detailing how Ethan had acted impulsively, driven by desperation and rage. Gavin understood that by remaining silent, he had allowed his friend to spiral deeper into darkness. As the confession unfolded, the detective listened intently, piecing together the narrative that had plagued the investigation. Gavin spoke of the affair, the blackmail, and how their lives had been irrevocably altered by their decisions. By the time he finished, a sense of relief washed over him, but it was quickly overshadowed by the looming reality of the consequences they would face. Following the confession, both men were taken into custody. Gavin and Ethan, once respected figures in their community, now faced public scrutiny and condemnation. The trial that followed was a whirlwind of emotions. During the trial, the prosecution presented a compelling case, highlighting the evidence against both men. The murder weapon, Ethan's fingerprints, and Gavin's confession painted a damning picture of their guilt. The defense attempted to argue that Ethan acted out of a moment of passion, emphasizing the emotional turmoil stemming from Alex's manipulative actions. However, the prosecution countered, showcasing that both men had ultimately made conscious choices that led to the tragedy. As the jury deliberated, both Gavin and Ethan sat in silence, haunted by the reality of what lay ahead. They exchanged glances filled with a mixture of regret and disbelief, realizing that their friendship had been built on a foundation of deceit and impulsiveness. Finally, the jury returned with a verdict. The courtroom fell silent as the judge announced the sentence. Gavin and Ethan were both found guilty of second-degree murder, receiving substantial prison sentences. As they were led away in handcuffs, the weight of their choices hung heavily in the air, a stark reminder of how quickly their lives had unraveled due to passion, betrayal, and the shadows of deceit.